The 1960s were an era of bold experiments in television. Sitcoms, fantasy comedies, and outlandish concepts shaped a generation of entertainment. Yet many of these shows reflect values, stereotypes, and storytelling devices that feel shockingly outdated by today's standards. Looking back, these 12 series remind us how much television and society has changed. Here are the ones that would never be made today. Gilligan's Island, 1964 to 1967. On the surface, Gilligan's Island looked like family-friendly comedy. 7 castaways stranded on a deserted island, getting into slapstick mishaps that never seemed to end. But scratch beneath the goofy laughs, and it's clear why this show would be impossible to produce in today's cultural climate. For one, the female characters were written almost exclusively as stereotypes. Ginger Grant, the glamorous Hollywood starlet, was designed to be the eye candy of the group, often the subject of gags that played on her attractiveness rather than her intelligence. Mary Ann Summers, on the other hand, was the sweet girl next door, wholesome and innocent, a foil to Ginger's sultry persona. Neither woman was given much depth or independence. They existed to serve male-driven storylines, not their own arcs. Though humor often relied on making Gilligan the butt of every joke, portraying him as bumbling to the point of ridicule. While slapstick is timeless, the cruelty toward Gilligan often bordered on mean-spirited, a style of humor less tolerated by modern audiences. Worse still, the occasional appearances of so-called native tribes leaned heavily into offensive cultural stereotypes. These depictions, treated as harmless at the time, now stand out as insensitive caricatures that erase authentic representation. What's fascinating is how beloved the show remains as rerun nostalgia. Families who grew up watching Gilligan's antics often recall it fondly, but if a modern network attempted a reboot without drastic changes, outrage would follow. Today's viewers demand characters with depth, comedy that doesn't demean, and sensitivity to cultural portrayals. In 1964, Gilligan's Island was innocent escapism. In 2025, it looks like a relic of television's past, a show that proves how different society's expectations have become. The Dick Van Dyke Show, 1961 to 1966. Few sitcoms hold the legendary status of The Dick Van Dyke Show. Praised for its sharp wit, groundbreaking performances, and sophisticated humor, it shaped the future of television comedy. Yet, for all its brilliance, it also reflected a rigid set of cultural norms that would never pass unchallenged in today's era of equality-driven storytelling. Mary Tyler Moore's Laura Petrie was iconic for her charm and wit, even breaking barriers by appearing in capri pants on television. Something daring at the time, but her character's existence revolved around her husband Rob, a television writer played by Dick Van Dyke. While Rob got to thrive professionally, Laura's entire arc was tied to domestic life. Many episodes reduced her to the nagging wife trope, often played for laughs at her expense. The humor also reinforced unrealistic gender expectations. Laura was portrayed as beautiful, fashionable, and endlessly supportive, even when Rob's work consumed him. In contrast, Rob was the rational center of the household, the breadwinner who dictated the family's stability. That division between the serious man and the emotional woman reflected cultural attitudes of the 1960s, but it would feel antiquated and even regressive if presented today. Even beyond gender roles, the show upheld the fantasy of perfect suburban life, the neat home, the stable marriage, and the absence of deeper conflict. In the 1960s, that vision resonated with Middle America. In today's age of diverse storytelling and complex, flawed characters, it feels more like propaganda than reality. While still hailed as a masterpiece, The Dick Van Dyke Show is ultimately a snapshot of another era. To make it today, the dynamics would have to be rewritten, giving Laura equal professional agency, breaking away from domestic stereotypes, and acknowledging that families don't fit into neat black and white boxes anymore. Mr. Ed, 1961 to 1966. At first glance, Mr. Ed seems like light-hearted fun, a sitcom about a talking horse who only communicates with his owner, Wilbur Post. It was silly, charming, and unique, the kind of novelty premise that television thrived on in the early 60s. But peel back the humor, and you find layers of outdated attitudes that wouldn't survive today's audience scrutiny. Much of the comedy revolved around Wilbur's interactions with Mr. Ed. But when it came to Wilbur's wife, Carol, the writing leaned on sexist cliches. Carol was portrayed as the clueless wife, often nagging Wilbur or failing to understand his logic. The show regularly played up the idea that women couldn't grasp men's reasoning, reducing Carol to a one-note foil rather than a full character. Today, this dynamic would be flagged as both lazy and insulting. The gender politics weren't the only issue. The humor was simplistic, built around repetitive gags where Mr. Ed would sarcastically comment on human behavior. Audiences in the 1960s loved the absurdity, but modern viewers, raised on more sophisticated comedy, would find it thin. Networks today avoid shows that dismiss women's intelligence while relying on gimmicks as the central hook. Culturally, Mr. Ed reflected a time when entertainment didn't take female characters seriously, instead reinforcing the image of men as rational and dominant. The fact that a horse was given more wit and intelligence than the wife says everything about how the show viewed gender roles. While Mr. Ed lives on as a quirky memory of television's experimental years, it's also a stark reminder of how far storytelling has come. In 2025, producers would either completely rewrite Carol into a strong, equal character or abandon the concept altogether. The era of laughing at women's supposed silliness is over, and rightly so. Green Acres, 1965 to 1971. When Green Acres first aired, it flipped the premise of the Beverly Hillbillies on its head. Instead of poor country folk moving to the city, this sitcom followed a wealthy Manhattan lawyer and his glamorous wife relocating to a rural farming community. The comedy came from their inability to adapt, but also from the way the show mocked rural life. Oliver Wendell Douglas, played by Eddie Albert, was portrayed as earnest but perpetually frustrated by his oddball neighbors. His wife Lisa, played by Eva Gabor, was depicted as frivolous, materialistic, and utterly uninterested in farm life. Much of the humor revolved around Lisa's incompetence with chores, her obsession with luxury, and her inability to fit in. This characterization reduced her to a stereotype, the clueless, pampered wife, reinforcing outdated gender roles. Beyond gender politics, the show leaned heavily on ridiculing small-town people. Residents of Hooterville were drawn as backward, simple-minded, and resistant to logic. The intended humor was in how absurd they seemed, but in hindsight, the writing came across as condescending. Modern audiences would immediately criticize the classism and elitism, seeing it as a show that mocked rural communities rather than celebrating them. While Green Acres was beloved in its time, with its quirky humor and surreal gags, it wouldn't stand a chance in today's cultural climate. Television has grown more sensitive to how rural life and working-class communities are portrayed, steering away from broad caricatures. A modern reboot would need to give Lisa agency, portray Hooterville citizens with dignity, and find humor without demeaning entire groups of people. In the 1960s, it was lighthearted escapism. In 2025, it looks like a show built on stereotypes that audiences would find uncomfortable and outdated. Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In, 1968 to 1973. Laugh-In was one of the most groundbreaking comedy shows of the late 1960s. A rapid-fire sketch series filled with catchphrases, political jabs, and slapstick. It pushed the boundaries of television comedy. At the time, it felt revolutionary. But viewed through today's lens, much of its humor would be considered too offensive or politically incorrect to air. The show relied heavily on one-liners and gags that frequently targeted women, often reducing them to glamorous props for the male host's punchlines. Female cast members were routinely objectified, paraded in bikinis or revealing costumes as eye candy, while the men delivered the actual jokes. The writing leaned into sexist tropes, treating women less as comedians and more as stage decoration. Beyond gender, the show's humor often poked fun at racial and cultural stereotypes. Jokes that were accepted in the 1960s would today be met with outrage, accused of reinforcing harmful caricatures. At the time, pushing boundaries was celebrated. Now, audiences expect inclusivity, nuance, and humor that doesn't demean marginalized groups. Even its political satire, once considered edgy, might not translate well in the age of hyperpartisan discourse. What felt sharp and subversive in 1968 might come across as insensitive or oversimplified in 2025. That said, Laugh-In paved the way for modern sketch shows like Saturday Night Live. Its speed, irreverence, and topical jokes influenced generations of comedians. But the casual sexism and reliance on stereotypes would doom it today. A modern reboot would have to overhaul its writing staff and tone entirely, retaining the energy but discarding the outdated attitudes. In its time, Laugh-In was daring and iconic. Today, it stands as a reminder of how much comedy has evolved and how much further it still has to go. I Dream of Jeannie, 1965 to 1970. Few shows captured the fantasy sitcom craze of the 60s like I Dream of Jeannie. Starring Barbara Eden as a magical genie who lived in a bottle, the series was whimsical and playful. But its central premise, a woman literally existing to serve her male master, makes it one of the most glaring examples of outdated television. Jeannie's entire identity revolved around her devotion to astronaut Tony Nelson, played by Larry Hagman. She called him master, granted his every wish, and existed solely to please him. While Eden played the role with charm and wit, the dynamic reinforced the idea of women as subservient to men, their worth tied to obedience and beauty. Beyond the troubling power imbalance, the show's censorship rules made things even stranger. Jeannie's costume was deliberately designed to cover her navel, as showing it on television was considered too risque. Meanwhile, she was constantly portrayed as seductive, her power tied directly to her sexuality. This contradiction highlights the restrictive and hypocritical attitudes toward women's representation in the 1960s. Modern audiences would also notice how little Jeannie was allowed to develop beyond her role as Tony's servant. She was not an independent character with her own dreams or goals. She was a magical helper, often infantilized despite her immense power. The show became a cultural touchstone, and Barbara Eden's performance remains iconic, but to produce it today would require a complete overhaul of its central premise, transforming Jeannie into a partner, not a servant, and giving her agency equal to her male counterpart. In the 1960s, it was escapist fantasy. In 2025, I Dream of Jeannie looks more like a cautionary tale about how entertainment once glamorized inequality. Bewitched, 1964 to 1972. At first glance, Bewitched feels like one of the most harmless sitcoms of the 1960s. A charming witch marries a mortal man, and chaos ensues as she tries to live a normal suburban life. But beneath the sparkle of Samantha's nose-twitching magic lies a troubling subtext that would never pass unchallenged today. Samantha, played by Elizabeth Montgomery, had immense power. She could change reality with a simple gesture, yet the premise of the show was that she should suppress her gifts to please her mortal husband, Darren. He constantly insisted that she live as an ordinary housewife while he provided for the family. The message was clear: even a woman with world-altering abilities should hide her talents for the sake of male authority. Episodes often revolved around Samantha trying to sneakily use magic to help her husband while simultaneously reassuring him she wasn't threatening his ego. It painted female empowerment as something dangerous or emasculating, a storyline that reflects the cultural anxieties of the time when women were beginning to push back against rigid gender roles. The show also leaned on stereotypes through its supporting characters, like the overbearing mother-in-law, Endora, portrayed as meddling and bitter, reinforcing the cliché of older women as shrewish nuisances. What was once comedic now feels like a dated mockery of women's independence. Despite this, Bewitched remains beloved for its creativity and Montgomery's performance. It opened the door for fantasy sitcoms and influenced later series. But in 2025, a network would never produce a show where a woman is told to deny her power simply to protect her husband's pride. A modern version would flip the dynamic, celebrating her abilities rather than punishing them. The Flying Nun, 1967 to 1970. Few shows exemplify the oddball creativity of the 1960s quite like The Flying Nun. Starring a young Sally Field as Sister Bertrille, a nun whose habit allowed her to literally fly, it was marketed as whimsical family entertainment. Yet today, the series would almost certainly be deemed offensive, not for its silliness, but for its irreverent treatment of religion. The central gag, a nun floating through the skies because of her oversized headpiece, reduced an entire faith tradition into a cartoon. While audiences at the time enjoyed its novelty, Catholic groups were uneasy even then, and in today's cultural climate, such a portrayal would spark outrage. Religion is treated with more caution in modern media, and the idea of turning nuns into slapstick characters would likely be dismissed as disrespectful. The show also leaned heavily on stereotypical gender roles. Sister Bertrille, though played with sincerity by Sally Field, was often depicted as naive and childlike, a good-hearted but silly woman. Her intelligence and independence were secondary to her gimmick, the ability to fly. By making a nun's spiritual dedication secondary to comedy, the series undermined both women and religion at once. Ironically, Sally Field herself later admitted she hated the role, feeling embarrassed and trapped by the show's absurd premise. She spent years shedding the Flying Nun image to be taken seriously as an actress. That speaks volumes about how dated the concept was, even for its time. In the 1960s, The Flying Nun was quirky escapism. In 2025, it would be seen as trivializing faith and reinforcing outdated portrayals of women. Networks wouldn't touch it, except perhaps as parody. My Mother the Car, 1965 to 1966. Widely regarded as one of the strangest flops in TV history, My Mother the Car was built on a bizarre premise. A man's deceased mother is reincarnated as his automobile, and she communicates with him through the radio. Even in its own era, critics mocked it mercilessly, and today it has become a punchline for worst sitcom ever. But beyond its ridiculous concept, the show also reflected outdated cultural ideas that wouldn't fly now. The mother, voiced by Ann Sothern, spent the series nagging her son David, advising him on life, love, and career choices. It leaned heavily into the stereotype of the overbearing mother, a trope that dismissed older women as meddling nuisances. The central dynamic also reinforced patriarchal family structures. The mother, despite being the central character, was reduced to a literal vehicle, stripped of agency, trapped as a talking object, and defined only by her role in relation to her son. It was unintentionally symbolic of how women, especially older women, were often sidelined in 1960s television. The comedy itself was simplistic, with jokes that felt forced even then. Modern audiences, accustomed to layered storytelling and smarter humor, would dismiss it instantly. Streaming platforms wouldn't dare to gamble on such a premise unless it was deliberately satirical. What's fascinating is how much the show has endured in memory. Not as a success, but as a cautionary tale. It represents the kind of bizarre, tone-deaf television experiment that simply couldn't exist in today's landscape. In the 60s, it was mocked. In 2025, it would be canceled before it even aired. The Patty Duke Show, 1963 to 1966. At first glance, The Patty Duke Show looked like a wholesome, family-friendly sitcom with a quirky twist. Identical cousins living under the same roof. Patty played both roles, the fun-loving, boy-crazy American teenager and her sophisticated, studious Scottish cousin. It was a clever showcase for Duke's talent, but beneath the charm lay cultural attitudes that wouldn't survive today. Much of the comedy revolved around gender expectations. Patty, the American cousin, was portrayed as frivolous, obsessed with fashion, popularity, and dating boys. Her cousin Kathy, meanwhile, represented the ideal of the proper young lady, cultured, polite, and modest. Together, the contrast reinforced limiting stereotypes, women as either silly and shallow, or overly prim and repressed. Neither character had real depth or independence outside of how they navigated relationships and social status. Episodes frequently portrayed Patty as a schemer who constantly got into trouble, with lessons that reinforced conformity rather than independence. For female characters, success was often defined by how well they fit into traditional roles, whether as a good girl or an acceptable rebel who eventually fell in line. Modern audiences would criticize this binary, demanding richer, more complex portrayals of women. Another issue lies in the series' view of adolescence. While teens in the 1960s related to Patty's antics, the show often trivialized young women's intelligence, reducing their struggles to crushes, clothes, and social standing. Today, such portrayals would be criticized as shallow and harmful, ignoring the deeper emotional lives of young women. Despite these issues, the show remains a nostalgic artifact. Patty Duke's performance is still celebrated for her dual-role mastery. But in 2025, no network would produce a sitcom that reduced female identity to dated stereotypes about fashion and boyfriends. The Beverly Hillbillies, 1962 to 1971. One of the most watched shows of its time, The Beverly Hillbillies told the story of a poor backwoods family who strike oil and move to Beverly Hills. The Clampetts' fish-out-of-water antics drew huge ratings, but the entire concept leaned heavily on classist stereotypes that would be deemed offensive today. Jed Clampett, Granny, Jethro, and Ellie Mae were portrayed as lovable but ignorant, country folk too naive to understand the sophistication of city life. Their misunderstandings fueled the comedy, but at the cost of portraying rural people as backward, foolish, and incapable of adapting. Ellie Mae, for instance, was often reduced to jokes about her tomboyish behavior or her inability to attract the right kind of man. The show thrived on the contrast between hillbilly values and wealthy elites, but the humor almost always came at the expense of the Clampetts. While audiences laughed with them occasionally, they were more often laughing at them, reinforcing negative stereotypes about poor rural families. In modern times, when sensitivity to classism and regional identity is sharper, this dynamic would likely spark outrage. The gender roles were equally outdated. Women like Ellie Mae were expected to find fulfillment through marriage, while Granny was depicted as a comical, outdated matriarch whose old-fashioned ways clashed with progress. These portrayals would feel regressive in an era that demands more nuanced female characters. Still, the show remains iconic, remembered for its theme song and massive success. But if pitched in 2025, a series mocking rural families for laughs would be considered offensive. What once united America in laughter now serves as a reminder of how humor has evolved and how class stereotypes can cut deep. Amos and Andy, syndication into the 1960s. Though its original run ended in the 1950s, Amos and Andy continued to air in syndication throughout the early 1960s. At the time, many Americans still tuned in, but soon the series was pulled entirely from television. The reason? Its portrayal of African Americans was built on harmful stereotypes that are now universally condemned. The show originated as a radio program in the 1920s, with white actors voicing black characters in exaggerated dialects. When it transitioned to television, black actors finally played the roles, but the scripts still leaned on caricatures of laziness, buffoonery, and incompetence. For decades, it reinforced racist tropes that reduced black characters to comic relief rather than complex human beings. By the 1960s, civil rights groups were increasingly vocal about the show's damaging influence. The NAACP protested its syndication, arguing that it perpetuated dangerous stereotypes at a time when the fight for equality was at its peak. Networks eventually pulled it from circulation, making it one of the first major casualties of evolving cultural awareness. Today, Amos and Andy stands as a stark reminder of how entertainment once normalized racism. It's studied in classrooms as a cautionary example of media's role in reinforcing prejudice. Unlike other shows on this list, which might be reimagined or rewritten for modern audiences, Amos and Andy is simply unrevivable. Its very foundation was discriminatory, and no amount of retooling could erase that history. In the 1960s, some viewers laughed. In 2025, the show is recognized for what it was, an offensive relic of America's past that would never, under any circumstance, be produced again. The 1960s brought unforgettable television, but many classics reflect values long left behind. What once passed as comedy or entertainment now feels outdated, insensitive, or downright shocking. These 12 shows remind us that times change, and so must storytelling. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more deep dives.